Hi, everybody.
Hi, everyone.
So what we have for you today is the guilt complex, how to overcome it and win. This is one of the most common configurations of complexes that people suffer from. But they usually, when it's ego identified with, and invariably it is, they don't see it because it's so embedded into the field of their life that it interferes with everything. So there's a number of elements to this, one of which we won't go into today because we're going to have a follow-up one on Adler and the inferiority-superiority complex. But Adler's power principle, overcoming feelings of inferiority by superior behavior and adaptations, which don't hold water. It's empty, we feel it on the inside. And then the reverse of that are very common secondary elements of a primary guilt complex. So the other two emerge as a kind of compensation for that primary one. But there are cases, of course, where the Adlerian power drive and their power complex originate wholly out of themselves or of independent circumstances. But very often the two are conjoined, which is why we're going to approach them in a series, but separately so we can deal with the nuances of both. So on the picture then, what we have obviously is the image of a judgment, and that's how we feel. It's either an inner judge, an outer judge, or usually a superpositioning between both of those. And the person's ego, their focus of awareness of themselves, their self-image and their self-concept, all immediately refer to this before they make a judgment or an interaction with anything or anyone. It becomes so closely identified with that this is the grand filter very often. And it has an awful lot to do, again, and this is where the overlap with Adler's power complex comes in, to do with status, rank, if you like, from rank theory, and where we position ourselves in life. But there's a fundamental question we need to ask immediately about guilt. And for that, we can look at the next card. Is the guilt legitimate or illegitimate? And this really is the beginning. This is the alpha and the omega, the end of the whole issue to do with a guilt complex. Is the guilt that we feel in any given set of circumstances legitimate because we have done something which we consider to be morally wrong? Or is it which is something that's been imposed upon us by others, or that we've internalized through suggestion and then immediately boot up in relationship to our experience of the world? And if it's illegitimate guilt, then there is no apparent solution for it because we misattribute legitimacy to illegitimate feelings of self-guilt. So then the judgment field operates mainly internally, and that judge that we see in the representation here is one of our own making, and we judge ourselves. But one of the most important things to understand with any kind of representational image is that when we adopt them and use them to the extent that they become independent of our control, we in effect reify them, we turn them into something that they are not through their representation. So when we present images like this, there is no suggestion that there is such a thing as an inner judge, but there is something that functions that way and would present itself in that way through a form of meaning that we accept through auto-suggestion. We believe it, therefore we generate an understanding of which this would be a reification that we could readily believe in. But once we start to do that, we're already beginning to lose our autonomy with respect to the influences that have been on our life that have caused us to develop the guilt complex in the first place. So representations are hugely important to understand, and the ego must be capable not only of generating them, but of defending itself against them where they are harmful. But that defense against internal imagery is so nuanced because it involves all sorts of different ways of relating to those images, some of which are positive and some of which, of course, are not. That understanding how to do that will be something as well that's a very, very useful practical skill, including with guilt complexes, but more broadly with just about any kind of complex that forms, and then generates spontaneously a representation, or we internalize one and then internally project that over the so-called unconscious mind. Now, complex will agree with that and will hide behind the image. It will utilize it. And then we fall into various kinds of trap. So we can discuss this as we go on. But for now, I know that our friend Omar, who's joined us today, our colleague Omar indeed, and he has some points he'd like to raise to get the discussion going. Over to you, Omar.
Thank you, Steve. It's interesting with the just the discussion of the inner image or representation of a judge, because it's either, as you mentioned, it's either, I suppose, superpositioned on the outside, or a feeling or a judgmental feeling coming from the inside, or both. And I suppose the emphasis would vary depending on the person and their own field representation. But it's interesting how the representation can really be distributed across the field, and I suppose that in itself can act as a sort of, if the ego is not equipped to understand its own field, then that distribution seems to be more, then it hides the real issue at hand. Or if then the ego adjusts its perspective into widening, I suppose its net of useful things that it can inform it, then it becomes more, and the ego becomes more receptive, then the field becomes more informative, and the images shift and adjust in real time. So a judge really, whether in feeling or an image or whatever that representation appears to be, shifts from positive to negative, or vice versa as well. I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you. You've raised so many important things there. You've mentioned the distribution of the complex. And if anybody's unsure what that means, they need to think of themselves firstly as an extended mind. In other words, their normal consciousness does extend beyond their immediate experience, and it extends internally and externally. When it extends internally, then as far as the average person is concerned, they experience perhaps memories or interpretations of memories of the past where they have felt judged or felt guilty over various things. And then there's a forward projection as well, an anticipation it builds up based on past experience, where sometimes an internal image or series of images can project itself forward in time, and we can misjudge how we are going to cope with various challenges in the future. Again, where we might judge ourselves as being insufficient for a particular task or adaptation. And this is normal enough. This is the stream of consciousness that William James identified, for example. And it's the kind of thing that Freud looked for through free association to see what the ego was doing, what kind of pressure it was under. And of course, Jung would look for too in his word association tests, which he measured against psychophysiological measurements of stress. And Jung particularly demonstrated, of course, how complexes exist not only psychologically, but socially and physically, biologically. They are biopsychosocial. And in our present time, we consider that to be a field phenomenon. And that is the extended field that goes beyond only psychology. So some aspects of the field of a complex will somaticize, others will exist in the environment, socially, and even in the natural environment, to be associated with places, seasons, time of the year, that kind of thing. Significant events that are predicted, like birthdays, all those things form part of this field. And subjectively, we can experience how complexes generate opportunities for the ego to attach to these images and add them to the field of the complex, so they persist. These are the typical ruminations that people have, that kind of thing. And what we have there is a complex trying to locate itself in different parts of the extended mind of the person who's suffering. So the past, the present, and the future all seem occupied simultaneously by the representation of the complex. But that representation, as you rightly say, is distributed into different forms. But there is a primary representation at the core. And that's that which formed as the original imprint and meaningful representation at the time it first formed. And then it acquires other associations to it. So that's the unfortunate side of all complexes, that they're quite capable of doing that, of existing in these different states simultaneously. And it's curious, isn't it, that time doesn't seem to matter to a complex. We look into the past and it wants to be there. In the present, it makes us believe that it is. In the future, it tells us that it will be there. So it's already existing in those different states, and the ego, with its limited capacity to deal with information, then collapses around the influence of the complex. So that's the fundamental problem. I mentioned Freud and free association before, and in terms of techniques for dealing with complexes, that's still very, very valid, provided it's done properly. Because then we kind of ride the field and the waveform with associations that emerge out from someone. And as we were saying before, that you were sharing before off camera, to do with the what is in our model the ego, alter ego, and moral complex, that is derived from two sources really. One is from Freud. Freud's very valid clinical observations of id, ego, and superego. And then Anthony Stevens is a Jungian who was also ethologically orientated, who thought that Jung's model lacked a representation of a moral complex, something that was very real. So within that overall theoretical distributed framework, we have something real that is actually disguised by the different theories, because there's the experience of a moral complex acting to generate a guilt complex, and then there's what it's like to suffer. And when we work either on ourselves for personal development or clinically with others, it's the suffering that we need to address more than anything. But these different theories can teach us a great deal about how things represent and configure and what we can do about those.
Yeah. Thinking in particular to Anthony Stevens' ethological model, and how the experience, I suppose, of guilt towards a situation, a person, or whatever the case may be, that at bottom there is I suppose a natural environment for humans where instincts have evolved to adapt to, and at base there is a natural order of things, of these instincts that represent themselves, but even those are flexible enough that they can co-activate and such, where a moral or a moral issue can be resolved by actually understanding what the instinct underneath is trying to bring across. And often, obviously, complexes are the ones that divert the flow, I suppose, of the information, or these in the form of instinctive pressure. So there's a great deal of flexibility there, where complexes really divide the ego, or divide the individual into feeling that there is only one or two paths to go to. And this is what you're talking about, how the complex distributes itself, or finds or wants to distribute itself in the past and the present, and paces and leads the ego into maintaining itself into the future. But to go back to that redistribution into, I suppose, a more healthy state without unnecessary or without suffering, then an altered being able to enter into an altered state of consciousness where that allows where the ego is allowed to relax and receive the field of the meta instinct, then the field opens up into something that can be healing, and where the complex is sidestepped, and not really conflicted with in any direct way. But again, that as well, if that was not immediately present for an individual, then obviously other fields enter, as in other people or external information that one might come across either by chance or by intention. And then the conflict of the complex going against that external field, or that might actually set in motion something more healthy, then is experienced as, I suppose, a judgment, either by this field or by an external person. If it was a therapist, then the complex will attempt in every way to polarize the experience of the person, of this therapist, or family member, whoever an individual might be. And the pressure then really amps up, and there, of course, there is the opportunity there for resolution, and how one manages that or not is really key.
Yeah, you've summed that up really well, Omar. Really, really well.
Yeah. Well, you've described the solution essentially, Omar, haven't you? Which is an instinctive solution, but also the way in which complexes will defend themselves under certain conditions. The other thing that occurred to me as you and Steve were speaking too is one of the most insidious elements I think of any complex, let alone a guilt complex, is the predictive nature of them, the future orientated nature of them too, that suggests, that kind of writes the narrative for us, or because it's identified with us, with our self-concept, with our self-image, that we allow it to write the narrative for us going forwards. And people can sometimes literally waste the whole of their lives, in the sense that they become written into that narrative to such an extent that it plays out, and it plays out in, if it was a play or a drama, that person would be the tragic hero. It would reach a tragic conclusion because their lives have been so taken over by it, or the distribution of the complex into so many different areas of that person's life. It is such that then is their future trajectory. So the goal that they're orientated towards is ultimately is a negative one, a destructive one. And I think we see that particularly with things like the illegitimate guilt that we're describing, where there appears to be no capacity within that person's life or context for them to redeem themselves. It just seems to be spiraling downwards to an inevitable conclusion, which is a tragic one. And of course, that's incredibly sad when a guilt complex takes a hold of a person to that extent, that it literally directs the course, the trajectory of their life. And hopefully, as we go on today, we'll be, we'll be looking a little bit more at what you suggested to be the instinctive solution to things, Omar, because it is there. There is a solution to it, which is maybe a little bit more difficult to get to than if it was the legitimate side of guilt, because there are processes, there are rituals which are embedded in our deep psyche that allow us to reach in and to transform ourselves, maybe more readily than somebody who is suffering from so-called illegitimate guilt. But they are both resolvable. That's the point, isn't it? Just by maybe slightly different means.
That's great points, Paul. Absolutely. And yes, we are going to go through those different stages of understanding for both legitimate and illegitimate guilt, and how the whole thing has arisen in an evolutionary sense, how it operates in our contemporary culture, what forms of representation it takes at the cultural level, and how they are internalized, and the resolution that's necessary to move on and adapt. But yeah, I mean, another thing that Omar raised was how these different models of representation can become problematic in and of themselves. And I mean theories here.
Yes.
So Freud's model was born out of his experience. It was an original experience. He was a collaborator, of course, with Joseph Breuer. And Breuer did contribute a huge amount to the foundations of Freud's model, because they worked with the same people out of the same consulting rooms, for several years. But the eventual distillation into the id, ego, and superego was the result of Freud's journey. And with all proper respect to him and the conditions under which he worked, that model became a problem in and of itself. Instincts for Freud were essentially negative and irrational, hence the id. And that's because the people who were turning up in his consulting rooms were suffering from frustrated instincts, which is interesting because of Anthony Stevens' perspective on that. He gave it a different name, but he was really talking about the same thing. He talked about frustration of archetypal intent. So he borrowed Jung, he borrowed the ufologists, and he made a syncretism of them, which was intended or otherwise a reinterpretation of Freud's observations. And I think Anthony moved both Jung and Freud on by doing that. He gave us the opportunity to seek an understanding of biology which had not been collapsed into psychology, even psychodynamic psychology. So the frustration of instinct that Freud experienced pressured the ego. And this was the pleasure principle, as he called it, that this idea that I need to be gratified. And he put that into the context of childhood, hence his stages of psychosexual development, which he's been so criticized for. There's some truth in it, but he probably overstated it. And then when he generated his construct of the Oedipus complex, which is again highly controversial. And I would just add here that Mark Solms, for example, says there is no Oedipus complex. It doesn't exist. He's that radical as a contemporary Freudian about that. I would say that there are presentations or representations that suggest that the idea for some people is well-founded, but only because of the representation. Something represents itself as that, and that representation is a real phenomenon. That doesn't mean, though, that we should take that at literal face value as something that represents from the inside out towards a therapist for interpretation. We should receive it, but treat it as a representation, and then look at biology. We step aside from psychology, ordinary psychology, completely. And in order to do that, we have to go into the world of the ethologists, human ethology, which is a specialized subset of ethology in the broader sense, and look at the remnants, I'll call it that for explanatory or descriptive purposes, the remnants of our ancestral past, which shows up very, very clearly in our development. And when we do that, then the representation of the Oedipal complex that a Freudian would interpret so precipitously actually becomes relative, because we can understand it in terms, this is the ancestral psyche in this individual case, representing something that may have had some primordial value for adaptation and representation in the remote past, and it's occurring now for this person in the present, because that representation's persisted. And what we need to do then is to deal with the Oedipus complex in our experience is not to treat it in a Freudian way, but look at it in a positive, instinctive way, to say what is behind that is trying to get past it, but is giving us a representation of something that we need to receive, firstly, not repress, suppress, deny, as Mark Stockley would do, but actually receive it and interpret it in a different way. Because when we receive something, it's almost invariable that what we receive changes. That indicates that it's dynamic and it's not fixed, but it does insist itself. The representation says, this is what I am right now. Are you looking? Can you communicate? If you do, I will change. If you don't, I will push in my current configured form. And what that will do is, if this is an instinct or a meta instinct, something from the genome which is pushing adaptively, that then will generate a complex. The complex will split off and function autonomously, mess up the ego, and mess up the lifespan development time release trajectory that was intended all along. So this is why I was saying earlier, it's so important to work with representations properly and not to stamp a theory on it. Receive it, obviously understand the theories that have attempted to explain this in the past, but then work intimately with a human being in the moment to look for the corrections which are arising in the background. That was one of the most valuable things that Jung came up with, this idea that the psyche is self-regulating and it's looking for compensation. So even when things like the Oedipus complex turns up, and it does turn up representations of that. And sometimes there's been sexual abuse associated around it as well, which Freud also found. So we cannot have a blanket dismissal of it. But where somebody has been influenced by a therapy dogma to present that in order to justify a feeling of guilt, you can see how we as therapists can be manipulated like that, because, oh yeah, that's the Oedipus complex. And once you accept that as a psychoanalytically orientated therapist, everything that the dogma says that you must do will follow, because you will create it in the mind and the extended field of the person that you're trying to help. And the guilt complex will take it on because it confirms it. But if we receive something like that as a representation of instinct, which has become fixed, as there is no communication with it, and a complex has split off and utilized it and adapted and weaponized that to attack the ego, to make the ego need the complex, very, very different perspective. So Freud, I would say then in summary, misunderstood instinct. He was well-intentioned, but he received the negative as if that's all it was. And then he developed the notion later of the superego, as being that which resolves the Oedipus complex. And of course, the superego is the origin of all of the morality issues, according to Freud, that we experience early on in life and carry on over into the future. But that's the resolution for him of the Oedipus complex. So the pleasure principle then becomes the reality principle, and we learn that through the superego. It says you can do this, you can't do that with your id or with your instincts. And at a practical level, given the times in which he lived and flourished, it was reasonable, but he was a pioneer. So pioneers always make mistakes from the perspective of posterity. When people look back, they can see them. At the time, no, perhaps we can't. So that was Freud's position, and he entrenched himself with it. Jung moved on. He was heavily influenced by Pierre Janet, and I think that was wonderful. That did Jung a lot of good, understanding how the psyche dissociates into subunits of itself. Janet had his own terminology for that. Jung preferred the term complex, even though Freud had used it with Breuer before him. But he elaborated the model of complexes well beyond Freud's use of it, paralleled that of Janet, and arguably made it easier to understand than Janet's model, arguably. But from that, then we can see how morality for Jung is a complex, but also for him what he called an archetype. And without going into depth on what archetypes are, that showed that there was a collective level to it, because an archetype is a unit of the collective unconscious. But the collective unconscious is also biological. It cannot be separated from it. So again, we're back into the realm of biology, and this is where Anthony Stevens updates Jung, I think, very effectively. And then we can look at how things are on timed release from the genome, and certain challenges occur, and so forth. So we do need to move into the ancestral psyche properly to understand things, which means we have to set aside theory as much as we can and let it speak for itself through its representations. So even Anthony's updating of Jung's archetypal model will only take us so far before that starts to ossify a little, and then we start to collapse around an ethological interpretation. Because when we work with real people who are really suffering, we have to get inside the field of that suffering and reach into homeostasis in a natural way without use of terms that aren't helpful at all. Because every time we apply in a clinical setting a model to a natural experience, we step away with each application, one more step away from the directness of the experience of that person and the homeostatic or self-regulating compensations that are trying to come through. So I thought it was really useful that you raised that off camera, and as we said at the time between us, that we should raise that, because it's going to become really important later on how we construct representations of these experiences. So even using the term guilt complex, to some extent, we have to justify that and then be capable of setting it aside, because any complex is a fixation. As Janet understood, he said fixed ideas, autonomous, subconscious, in his language, fixed ideas. And if we collapse around them, and as you were saying, Paul, then we fail to adapt to our potential and to our lifespan development. So we can make a start and say that this, in broad terms, is a guilt complex. But then we have to move away even from that term and start to work with the field of the person who is suffering at the right levels.
Yeah, I thought the point that you made too about Freud and the times within which he lived and practiced is really important, because obviously he lived through the Victorian era and the various repressions that went along with that. But the thing that struck me is that in many ways the culture, Western society now, is actually in many respects, more punitive even, I would say, than the times in which Freud lived. And so the kinds of repressions, the kind of complexes that we see now, you know, will be similar in that regard, because people being made to feel ashamed or guilty about having certain ideas or experiences. But I think the difference is now that it's almost as it's done in such a way that we're not meant to see it. It's hard to articulate really, but it's all part of the indoctrination, if you like, with respect to things like political correctness and identity politics and woke and all of that. And it's subtler in many ways. I think it's it kind of seeps into people in a way that is really, really insidious. And it makes it difficult, I think, therefore, for people like ourselves or those amongst us who are working therapists to be able to get this across sometimes, particularly as a lot of it has been legislated for as well. It's certainly here in the UK. It is now certain things that are within UK law that are so punitive. I mean, the stuff that I don't want to sort of get sidetracked into it, but stuff that we've come across even in the past few days,
It's horrific.
which is absolutely horrific, which is essentially to do with legislating against toddlers and babies doing hate speech, doing or saying inappropriate things, and it just beggars belief, doesn't it, that it's happening? But it is happening.
It's happening in Wales.
In Wales, here it is. Right?
territorial laws are being mooted.
Yeah.
Local within the boundary, well, it's semi-devolved, but it's part of the UK, about bringing legislation against toddlers
Yeah.
who use nicknames which an adult will find offensive as hate speech, even though the other toddler concerned in this instance
Yes.
was not at all bothered by it,
Not in the
but
least.
was bothered by the nickname being repressed.
Yes.
And that has reached a point now where the police are being brought in, not only for that case,
Yeah.
but there's an organised set of rules imposed by the current Welsh government
Yes.
to compel care workers or the childminders and the like to inform the police
Oh, yes.
and to involve them. And whereas the age of criminal responsibility is 10, we're talking about children who can barely speak up to the preschool level. That's how far this degradation has gone. There was a barrister who was presenting.
Oh, yes, it was. Yes.
So that, and he showed the documentation. This is real. This is how far it's gone.
Yeah.
Within one of the territories of the UK. There are reasons for that. We've discussed this in the past, and we need to know about what's actually directing all of this in order to be able to build a defense against it at the individual level. Otherwise, we get diluted into the culture. Our extended mind becomes cultural. We get atomized.
We do.
And that's why it's effective at spreading the field of its negative influence. So we need to help people resist it by becoming individuals, by generating safe boundaries around themselves, and accessing the ancestral psyche to contradict the way things are going at the moment at the cultural level. This is all important because shaming and the ritual of shaming people, as well as the legislation for it, are all part of the suppression of individuals and the engendering, if I can use that expression in this context, of neurosis, of a severe lifespan development neurosis, which takes on the form of what we could otherwise call a guilt complex.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. I was watching something the other day. It was something quite inane, really, because it was just a celebrity doctor talking about having intrusive thoughts of his own. He didn't go into detail, but I couldn't help but feel just even the fact that he declared that about himself actually paradoxically made him vulnerable.
Yeah.
And he probably shared it to help other people who maybe were no doubt turning up in his surgery and expressing similar sorts of things to literally put their minds at ease. But I think we're seeing an awful lot of it. I think when ordinary GPs start to speak out in that way, it suggests that we've got a huge problem on our hands.
Yeah.
And it is what we would call it the stuff of complexes, of course. But how we deal with that and what permissions we give ourselves to actually express some of the content is, well, it's under attack, isn't it?
Yeah.
We've got to be very, very careful, really, about the kinds of things that we admit to sometimes, because of the fact that they can be not just misinterpreted, but we could essentially find the full weight of the law behind us, depending on what we say and in what context. And there is a huge inhibition on people, I think, to be able to express things in an instinctive way that would simply just let off instinctive pressure and that would be job done. Yeah. Well,
So what thank you. What you said, I think, is describe the role of a medical practitioner as a collapsed form of shaman.
Yes, absolutely.
The influence of the doctor, the persona medici, as Jung described it, is of a neo-shaman in our contemporary times.
True.
Now, if such a person admits to having things like intrusive thoughts like that, the subliminal suggestion can include the idea that it's okay for us to have them.
Yes.
But at the same time, the person who can help us with them can't sort us out in themselves.
Yeah.
At that point, there's the complex. It says, I'll do it.
Yes.
I'll step in and I will handle all of this for you. That's what happens with a Jungian dissociation. It steps in to fill a gap. And in older, I'll avoid saying primitive, as Jung did in his day about such cultures, older cultures had ways of dealing with all of this symbolically through rites of passage. Shamans occupied a particular state, the elders occupied a particular state. And guilt and failure and shame, although shame was very dangerous for a person in this kind of cult, not the contemporary, although it is still a problem now, but in an earlier culture, should we say, it's a very, very dangerous thing if that was not dealt with, because it could lead to a person isolating themselves from a group and effectively starving themselves to death or being predated as a form of working the shame through. But these cultures had systems for dealing with shame. We don't. We at the moment, the dominant thing is that you will be shamed and manipulated with respect to your instincts to collapsing around the suggestion of the politically dominant force within the culture, which itself is actually under biological direction, as we know from the Freud-Adler-Jung equation. So we need ways of having a congruence between a culture that we can refer to, even if it's a subculture, and an internal ancestral state which confirm one another in a healing and transformative way. That's what we suggest, and that's how we help people when it comes to guilt complexes or being shamed, is a process which is neo-shamanistic in a contemporary sense, but can deliver rather than, in the case of the doctor,
Yeah.
shows that the idol has feet of clay, as the old saying goes. So there's nothing there. It's not based on anything. The slightest push and it will break. Then there's only complexes. And the complexes will say to them, you can't do anything about this culture, but I can generate fantasy after fantasy after fantasy, and then you can go and live in that space, in that domain, and not adapt. But you won't care because I'll be giving you everything you need to not adapt. That would break Freud's principles that there would be no pleasure principle, nor would there be any reality principle, only fantasy. And that's why Freud was against fantasy. And he was right insofar as those circumstances pertain. But fantasy's pushed all the time now as a kind of refuge for a culture that we're told we cannot change. So if you get a celebrity psychologist or psychiatrist pushing fantasy, then they become part of the problem and they get secondary gain out of the result of that, which will be attachment to them as a guru-like figure. But in order for the attachment to be maintained, people need to feel vulnerable. They need to split and they need to project. And then that makes them far more open to influence. I mean, this has happened with Jordan Peterson, obviously, and he's becoming a historical character now, Peterson. He's been around long enough for the trajectory of his life to take form. And it's possible for some people to look back and say, I can now see this. It was present at the beginning, the teleology of that particular guru, internet guru, and what's become of him, how ill he is at the moment, how his business empire is collapsing, everything else. All of that was presaged. It was predictable. It was going to happen. If you use a Jungian interpretation, a classical one, you can see those patterns unfolding. And then there are millions of people who identified with that person as being the exemplar of adaptation against cultural pressures. And now they're moving towards other kinds of fantasy-based gurus who are offering them a refuge. So Jung is being misused and misapplied to understand that process, whereas Jung actually gives us the understanding of how the inflation will go. But also there's a Freudian element there as well. And that Freud can make the prediction what happens when reality principle and pleasure principle fail. And Adler too tells us what will happen at the level of personal power when that's exaggerated. There is no real or genuine social interest in others. Put the three together, Freud, Adler, and Jung, and the whole thing is certainly predictable. And some people were predicting that 10 years ago about what would happen with Jordan Peterson as an exemplar of that. But there are other gurus who are out there doing the same thing right now. And people are being shamed by these gurus, being told that their lives are untidy and they need to tidy their room. And then there's 12 rules for life, and you find that that particular guru is religious in terms of a lot of his beliefs and delusions, and it starts to look like, well, the Old Testament had 10 commandments, Jesus had 11, and this guru has 12, and then he doubles it to 24, and you can see there is the inflation, and then he starts to collapse. His ideas get bizarre, his physical health suffers, there's primary and secondary delusions following on from that justify one another. And then there's the mass distribution of the alibi, the neurotic alibi, and the guiding fiction, how he's led himself into the state that he's in by people around him who are feeding off him as well and looking for an endpoint that they can still benefit from. And that's left a debris trail behind of so many people who have been influenced negatively and are now unable to adapt other than finding new gurus. So these are all real issues to do with how shame can be and guilt can be turned into a trap of suggestion, which is internalized. So dangerous things. But the ancestral psyche, as you were saying, Paul, has the solutions built in because it's experienced this over thousands and thousands of generations of repeated experience. So it's in the genome, the associated fields of the genome. But unfortunately, complexes and adaptations to the outer world take a lot of our attention, and we miss what we need to understand. So when we're working with someone who has a guilt complex, we need to establish, first of all, is this something that has been done? And there are ritualized cultural processes that will lift them out of that. And they can have ego strength by going through something that redeems them. Or is it illegitimate guilt put there through suggestion, either external or internal, and they are now collapsed behind that with only fantasy as a space or a domain that they can occupy for relief? And once we've got that clear, then we know what we can do. In the former case, we can guide them through that process so they can achieve the kind of balance that was achieved by the ancestral psyche through its interaction with Paleolithic culture. If, however, it's illegitimate, then only the equivalent of a shamanistic process, and I don't mean a shamanism being involved in the form of a therapist, because there are other aspects to that which need to be brought on, which are intrinsic to the person. But a shamanistic process of opening up to transformation is the appropriate way to go.
Yeah. Oh, it is just a
You-
great,
Sorry,
great.
can't hear you.
Oh,
Oh, yeah, you got your land.
oh, great. Yeah, there's a great, great deal there, and there's so many things that in my head that I'd like to go into, but I thought the cultural element was quite it's quite key actually in being able to deal with such a thing, because in the culture, I suppose, if we go back to the original subject of legitimate versus illegitimate, legitimate guilt, there are mechanisms to deal with, and those can easily be found in culture and such. But illegitimate guilt, then if we're thinking about an individual that is very intelligent, then they can have all the right ideas about how to resolve guilt, but then never really doing it and being stuck. And then, as an example for young men, then the whole red pill, blue pill kind of subculture on the internet then becomes quite a trap, because while on the surface it might actually reveal a lot of pseudo meta instinctive rules, I suppose, of biology, at bottom, given that it's based on something that is illegitimate, unresolvable by these mechanisms, then it embeds in itself a repetition compulsion, I suppose, from a Freudian perspective, where it just repeats and repeats and repeats, and then any individual that, I suppose, tries to aid the person that is stuck in there can also be paced and led because of the surface legitimacy of what is being attempted as a solution. as opposed to so that would be a trap, I suppose, for the therapist to look out for, as obviously having a model, a proper model of the quality of consciousness, for example, where we know that cognition has its limitations, then you can spot that immediately. But if that is not present, then it becomes just a play of logic and just trying to attempt to find the right thought, as you mentioned before, as at times actually what you want is to feel the right thing and not to think the right thing as the solution. But as well, the challenges right now for people attempting to get over such complexes is that the distribution of a complex now has become a little bit, has widened due to the technological advancement that we live in. So a distribution can easily be manufactured biologically, where it extends where the complex can present itself to a degree where the individual is still functional. But the issue now is way more distributed across multiple levels of the biopsychosocial system. So it becomes even more diffuse for a person that is not field informed to be able to locate where the problem is. So that is a huge challenge at the moment. And the political problem, if we talk about, I suppose, cultural political problems of wokeism and such, gives space to that to distribute and continue on distributing. And there was another point connected to that where I lost my train of thought, but it'll come back. It is also connected to culture, I suppose, and how complexes can distribute themselves easily. Oh yeah. So to your point, I think, Pauline, where you mentioned the comparison between how neurosis expressed itself in Freud's time, as opposed to now. Now it feels more diffuse, the issues that are coming up. And I think it is because any cultural representation of meta instincts have been so illegitimized and moved into more a fantastical representation that doesn't have a lot of biological anchors. That's even there, the diffusion have become easily allowed for, and then as for therapists, for example, it really is key to understand Anthony Stevens, because he's not like Jung in as he's anchored in the field of ethology, as opposed to Jung, where, as we've seen, one can easily be misled by fantasy, masquerading as meta instincts. So it can be more emphasized, the role of Anthony Stevens and what he contributed to the field of psychotherapy, and obviously to how you guys as well integrated that into meta instincts proper. That can then at least give us a proper starting point. And as you mentioned, by the end of your talk, Steve, is to be able to first of all properly distinguish between illegitimate and legitimate guilt, and start from there. That's just key.
Yeah, thank you for that, Paul.
Oh, you've said so many things there, Omar, which were important. I think including about the fact where we are in an information age now, so the propensity for information to just spread in so many different ways is far greater than it's ever been. And so if the culture embarks on a course of action where it decides collectively to shame someone, it is possible for it to just spread far and wide, in terms of how far and wide it moves away from, say, the individual person. So that's on a scale that it's never been on before in the past. And I mean, in many ways, we're still suffering now from the counterculture of the 1960s and 70s, where we're still living with the consequences of that. And, the politicization of our institutions, of our educational establishments, and the government workplaces, even some of our religious institutions. So we're still working with the indoctrination that has taken place since that time. And I guess the positive side of that is that at some point, hopefully, not too far in the future, we're likely to get a shift in another direction, because this is what history teaches us, that things, trends, what is counterculture now may well be something else, in the near future. There may be another shift, another change. We certainly hope so, from the direction in which we're going now. So it is a case of that we're living through a kind of a transitionary phase, and we have our, as I think you pointed out, we have our own subcultures which have grown up out of that are helping us, or they're meant to help us to adapt to the here and now. They don't always do that, of course. Sometimes they just make things worse. But if we collapse around those subcultures, then when we're still very much in the here and now, and we're not going back far enough into the past to see how things were dealt with in the distant, in the deep past. And I think that's where the ideas to do with biology, to do with the evolutionary psyche, to do with our instinctive lives comes from. So that's ultimately, that's the best way right now, I think, to deal with all of this, because what we're living through now, even with the various, as I say, adaptations to the different subcultures which have sprung up, is really just transitory. It'll change, and it will change again. So the safest way, the best known way over literally millennia is to go back into the deep past and to see how some of these things would have been dealt with back then, before we had, the information age, before we had, as I say, ways of shaming people like we've never had before. So if we don't attach ourselves to that, then we can be free of it, even though we're living through it, and we're still feeling the influence from it. We don't have to engage with it. So I think you said a lot of very important things there, Omar, which are so prescient for now, for today, and how we can best navigate all of this, because it can just seem like it's overwhelming. The extent of the power of the state, for example, over us, that in and of itself can sometimes feel so overwhelming that, well, how can we possibly deal with that? We just, as you were saying, Steve, we just feel atomized in the face of it, like we just don't have any intrinsic power ourselves, when clearly we do. But we just have to look in the right place, and then we get the answers, we get the solutions,
Yeah.
and they come quickly as well then. So, as I say, Omar, you raised a lot of very important issues there that we're all wrestling with, aren't we, as individuals and as working therapists as well too, because of course some of us are wearing both hats.
Yeah, I was very impressed with how you modelled all of that
Yes.
so well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
Thank you, thank you. But it is very prescient, I suppose, specifically now, and I see it very. I see it operating on a daily basis, given that I go to a martial arts club, and there I meet men younger and older than me that are in some place in their development, and the issues really represent themselves, or I see them represented across different levels, and well, not obviously not only with men but with women, but that is I suppose outside of my specific um, just not being a woman. I suppose I can always miss something there, but um, I can positively speak on the issues or the challenges for men, at least the ones that I meet on a daily basis, and it really is um, heartbreaking at times seeing where at all the thinking levels the person is on the right path, but it's just there's that missing point where the legitimacy of guilt or shame that is present have distributed the neurosis across many levels, um, that it becomes so diffuse and concealed, um, that it really is. It takes a great deal of humanism to receive such a thing, and then be gentle in the leading to a more meta instinctive solution.
Very well stated.
Yes.
Very, very well stated.
No.
Well done, Emma. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Right, we can move on, or we can take any further questions at this stage. We'll move on. So here we are back in the Judgement Field. So we have to time travel now. We're going to go back to the Paleolithic. And this is a representation of a primal wound which involves shaming, out of which would come in modern understanding a guilt complex. This young man is being shamed by people who are a little older than him, but they're not the elders of the tribe. That this is one rung down. This is the active dominant group of the masculine within his particular tribe. And something has happened. It could have been on a hunt. It could have been some kind of territorial battle with another tribal group, wherever it might have been. He's failed some understood standard which requires him to accept shame. And that's really important. The capacity to accept it, where it can be used and changed for the good, distinguishes at a Darwinian level how well we can adapt. This is common. This kind of thing still happens in the military in most countries, even today. The Japanese, for example, have a saying that if the nail stands up, we must knock it down. So a nail that stands too proud needs to be hit with the gavel, the hammer, if you like, of judgment, in order to guide them away from the otherwise erring path. So it's a conserved thing. It would have gone back then, but this society has to value its members. Any of them who is lost reduces the fitness, the survivability of the group as a whole. The shaming or the initiation of guilt, whereas it is legitimate, is necessary, as I say, at a Darwinian level in order to provide survival and fitness for this particular group. But for the young man concerned, he will feel the shame of not having met the standards of the group, of his lineage, his biology, everything to do with that. And it's a powerful humiliation. But within this are the seeds of redemption, if this is working properly. We've lost a lot of this. We've lost, as we were saying, and Omar was confirming in his experience, we've lost the ability to distinguish between legitimate and illegitimate guilt. Provided what this young man has done isn't so damaging to the group that it can't be repaired, provided it's not that, then he can be lifted out from it and be rehabilitated back into the group, and it'll be forgotten. It will be forgotten. Won't be forgotten by him. He would have learned a valuable lesson, and he'll become part of the system that imposes the same kind of standards on up and coming generations who are still probably pre-adolescents at the stage that this represents. But it is a kind of primal wound. But we have to be careful even about using that statement. Jungians are very easy about the idea of the wounded healer. The wound that doesn't heal somehow allows you to heal other people. I don't accept that. I don't accept it at all. I've seen problems with it in physical medicine. When I was doing my OT, occupational therapy training, I saw a physician who, a surgeon as well, who was involved in doing amputations, and he had one leg. And he was tasked with judging whether an amputation would be necessary or not. And when he walked in his distinctive way with his false leg down the ward, the people who were in there, who were going to be judged about whether they lose a limb or not, would look at the person who was going to make that decision and see their wound and feel absolute terror. So the wounded healer, and again, the doctor,
The doctor, yes.
that Pauline was
Yeah.
mentioning earlier,
Yeah.
the wounded healer doesn't heal. The wounded healer cross-infects. And Jung said that too.
Mhm.
He said, open wounds cross-infect. So being wounded by life is normal, unfortunately. But what we do about it, even if it leaves a scar, it should be healed. He also said that physicians need clean hands. Psychotherapists, psychiatrists need clean hands too. So in that sense, there are all sorts of institutions, and there should be in medicine. But I remember that, and I remember seeing the looks on the faces of people, and it's like, this guy will take my leg. I will, whether I need it or not, I will have an amputation or a double amputation. It may not be my leg, it might be my arm or wherever it might be. Maybe I've got sepsis or gangrene or whatever. And there has to be a life-saving amputation, but will he take it off at the point it needs, or will he take off the whole limb?
Yeah. Out of spite.
Out of spite.
Yeah.
Because of the wound that he has,
Yeah.
that he displays. Oh, I know the name of the physician. This was way back in the 80s, and I won't name him. But what I can say is that I saw no evidence of him working out through that wound, but the representation of it was enough to instill fear in people. So we have to be careful about what we do, and whether the representation is obvious or we communicate it subliminally through the field of a therapeutic relationship. Because the complexes that our patients suffer from will be scanning our field, and they will pick up a resonance, if it exists, and absorb it. And we may only know then by the way the complex attempts, as Omar was saying, to actually pace and lead us. Then we know that we've been seen into by something that understands our field, because we haven't adequately dealt with it ourselves. And that's whether we exhibit it or otherwise. These are real responsibilities the therapists must accept. But back in this context anyway, as wounding as this is, the healing is already latent within the culture. The healing is waiting this young man to move through this moment into the moments that will heal him. But they have been shaped by Darwinian selective pressures. Therefore, they will follow a predictable path. In our present time, though, the predictability has been mentioned by Pauline and by Omar, it's gone. There are prediction errors, if you like, that Mark Solms and others, Carl Friston, for example, mention a great deal. But what we can say is the complexes don't make many prediction errors. They've arisen out from predictions which have been positive for them. And because of their intimate knowledge of the ego that they occupy or control at a distance when those complexes are aligned rather than identified with, they can predict the ego. It's easy for them. And then they make what Friston and Solms would call prediction errors occur within the ego. But what those prediction errors do is sustain the complex. So if we don't have an adequate model of dissociation and of complexes based on Jung, based on Janet, based on Milton Erickson and Rossi, if we don't have that down to a field level, then we won't see them. Michael Levin talks about mind blindness. When we become complex blind as therapists, we allow them to do whatever they want to, uninhibited, and indeed we may well reinforce them. But the model for understanding all of this is to go back and see how did a homeostatic, less developed society in the Paleolithic or Mesolithic period, how did that work? Because those anticipations are still within us. At that point then, shame is transitory. Shame has within it the potential for its transmutation into its opposite properly by going through a process. Not opposites which are binary to the extent that they are neurotic, but they are complementary as one continuous process of the field interaction in the development of an individual's life. So we'll move on and see what happens then when the experienced middlemen within the group have pointed their accusing fingers. What's the next step in the process for our Paleolithic young man? This is the full ancestral context. And what we have here are the elders who are sitting with some of the older middle-ranking males, and they are delivering a judgment on what this young man needs to do in order to be accepted back into the group. But one of the first things he needs to understand is what has he transgressed and at what level. And usually such things have to do with the representations of the ancestral context. In other words, it's the ancestors themselves. Our ancestors did not do this. That is why this land is ours. That is why this cave is ours. And it is not occupied by bears, by cave lions, cave hyenas, or any other predators that were active then. We took this cave, we took this land. Our ancestors did the same. And you have failed to reach that standard that we accept and they accept. And in the presence of the elders, the ancestors are embodied. But there is a way out. You have to accept, first of all, something went wrong, but the healing process is available for you as we move on. And this is the process that follows. So the ancestral judgment is like our modern judge that we used on the thumbnail and on the first card, where we were looking at legitimate and illegitimate guilt. We can say that the judgment passed by the ancestral group, the council of elders, if you like, is that there was some degree of legitimate guilt. Once that's been done, he can be handed over to the expert, the equivalent, if you like, of what modern psychotherapists are supposed to do, the person who can go into the symbolic and dynamic representations that are not on the outside world, but are on the inside. Bearing in mind that both are continuous with one another, they are superpositioned, but it needs somebody who holds that role to be able to guide this young man into the state where he understands what he has to do. And this is the beginning of the process of removing shame. If shame persists, people are paralyzed by it. They can't move on. And in this sense, then, this shaman's role is to put that young man into a state where he can receive the ancestral spirits and the ancestral psyche. But it's not only that here. And it's usually not only that now. The process of psychotherapy is to prepare a person to make the necessary changes on the outside world of adaptation. First of all, receive the inner world, understand it, and then act in the world on the outside. So there is a hangover, a conserved understanding that has moved into the present from the Paleolithic and the Mesolithic periods of human evolution, biological and social evolution. So the shaman removes the shame because the shaman will get in the way. He will not be able to adapt to the outside world in the right way if shame still persists. Firstly, he in this context would have to understand that it is it is legitimate guilt. Then he has to go through a process of transformation. Now, in some cultures, this is only performed by the shaman, and the shaman takes it on for the person. But that's not probably how it originally was. That's a contemporary, retrospective projection of an overlap between the present and the past, which buffers people from doing certain things. So the shaman is given over to doing everything. You can see that, for example, in so-called less developed, or what Jung would have and did call primitive cultures that are in contact, intimate, local contact with, say, a first world aspect of culture. So the overlap changes both, that the shaman does it all for the person, or provides substances and therefore fantasies to do with changing things. But something which involves altered states of consciousness that don't involve substances as third parties to make somebody more hypersuggestible, but involves insight and understanding and feeling along the lines that Omar mentioned earlier about the metaqualia of consciousness, so things can be moved into different states and be complementary for one another. That is not as effective as this. And modern psychotherapy should be more like this than it is using fantasies or substances or taking people away from the task of life, as Adler would have understood it, of action in the world. This is not the end of the process. This is the preparation after judgment, where he accepts what he's done wrong and then finds within him the capacity to bring about the necessary change so the ancestors forgive him and accept him back. That's exactly the same as Jung's self-archetype coming through and curing a neurosis, or meta-instincts, which would include for us the so-called self-archetype as a representation of that, doing exactly the same thing. But for us, the altered state of consciousness is based around hypnosis. It certainly doesn't involve substances. They're not necessary. It does not involve fantasy. It involves a real engagement with the corrections that emerge homeostatically in a healing way from within when they're allowed to. So the shaman removes the shame, removes the need to identify with guilt, but leaves one thing in place, which is now you must do something, which is active and is transformative. So the council of elders and your extended peer group understand you've been through something that the ancestors laid down as necessary. Then you are part of that continuity. And it's all done. There is no residual damage, no residual harm. And interestingly, this is very much how dogs get rehabilitated by Cesar Millan into a pack. They become coherent with the collective ancestral mind of what it is to be a canine. But they have to do certain things. They have to act in a certain way. They have to display certain things. And it is true, certainly, of human beings.
That, Steve, requires somebody, I mean, you've mentioned Cesar Millan, somebody like him in the here and now, who, in terms of their understanding of these things, is coherent still with the past.
Yeah.
Because part of the problem now, I think, for people is that sometimes it's not clear what it is that they've transgressed, what it is that they've done wrong in our modern culture
Yeah.
now, with all the various complications as we've been discussing, to do with value systems and value sets. Sometimes people don't understand what it is that they've transgressed, whereas here in this context, here in this ancestral context, it would have been very clear what it was that had happened, and therefore what was necessary in order to compensate for that and to transcend
Yeah.
the guilt. It's much, much less clear now
Is-
in our present zeitgeist, and there's the difficulty that people have. Although ultimately, this is we have to rely on this, because this is when I say all we have, I don't mean that to reduce it. I mean, it's all we have in the sense that it is so ancient that it has to be free of the kinds of things that are complicating things for people now.
Yeah.
So it's the place to go for sure. But I do think this business of people not knowing sometimes what it is that they've done wrong because it's unclear
Yeah.
is a real problem in this day and age.
It's down to the complexity and the distribution that we've been talking about today, that complexity is just distribution. The distribution here is far more simple.
Yeah.
But it extends outwardly and inwardly simultaneously in a way which is congruent for this kind of culture to understand. If we look at the fire, for those who haven't looked at it, the smoke is taking on animal forms. Antlers are worn by the shaman. He's got a skin on as well. And behind him, there's a representation of that kind of thing without a human presence occupying it. So there's a movement from that pure animalistic persona, if you like, into a theriomorph. That is to say, the confluence and mixing together of the human and of the spirit. And then the fire is showing the energy and the release that he needs to understand. There are other representations on the cave wall, but the fire itself, the smoke, the product of the combustion of the energy and of the light is revealing what he needs to understand about the environment, which is both external and internal in a congruent way. In other words, they're superpositioned. Now, though, the distribution, as has been mentioned, into culture is so toxic that there is incongruence between the inner and the outer. And that incongruence means a separation, a division, which is a neurosis, a collective neurosis. This kind of situation allows meta instincts to be brought online sufficiently to contain what are called Panksepian drives, Panksepian instincts, by giving them a context for their expression. That way they don't turn into the Freudian id and become the fuel for a neurosis, which then becomes systematized into complexes. This prevents that from happening. And this is what we need to do for people who are so injured by separation off from their genome, from their ancestry, from their instincts. Then we don't need to do a Robert Bly and the men's movement and go and beat drums in the darkness under a full moon in some forest in America somewhere. We don't need to do that. What we need is something or someone who can occupy temporarily the role of a shaman to articulate this on the inside, bring about change for the ego, and then congruence with the external world through adaptation, because that satisfies Darwin. Darwin is the cruelest of all judges. You know? Occam's razor got nothing on the razor that's held by Darwin. Darwin is the efficient cause of the delivery into biology of the transpersonal from Plato. These are of such importance to understand at a symbolic, but then at a deeper meaning level. And then the therapist needs to occupy the right role. Not really these days as a shaman, but more as a psychopomp, but we can come on to that. The shaman can turn into a psychopomp and then avoid a lot of the neurotic attachments which occur through transference, for example. So this is the primal scene, and this young man is on the cusp of redemption and integration back into his group, but he does have to do something on the outside and not only on the inside. And a lot of psychotherapies, particularly the depth psychologies of today, take people on the inside and trap them there. They meet a pseudo shaman who offers them so many symbols, so many elaborations, that they can't do anything other than turn them into fantasies. And then they get an anxious attachment and they can't break it, and they're there for years. That is not biologically healthy. It is not psychosocially healthy. It certainly does nothing for individuation to be in that position. So Omar raised his hand, so I'll just... Omar, are you okay?
Yes, I was thinking about.
Or you're not coming through all right?
How about now?
Yeah, got you now, yeah.
Great. I was thinking about introducing the importance, I suppose, of the role of the shaman or any similar influence by an individual as an integral part of the developmental stages, as opposed to being the 4 developmental stages of confirmation. I mean, of the parents, peer group, intimate partner, and then the self. As somewhere there in the middle, there'll be a type of mentorship or of the sort, where for healthy development that should be occupied properly in the development of an individual.
Yeah, totally agree. And of course, that will be in place in such an environment. And on a contextual note, Paul and I feel that that's really how psychotherapy should be passed on. It should be through a mentorship role, because when that happens, the best of potential in a person is free to come out without being processed into some kind of homogenous, lowest possible level of understanding. The other thing it does, of course, is if somebody's not suitable, that also comes out. And that's part of the process. It's not easy to undergo a mentorship in a depth psychology model, because it's so challenging. But what it does do is challenge the person, the mentee, and they will fail if they are not right. There's a great deal of effort that has to go in to bring out that failure. But when people adapt because it's in their nature, that their character and calling, as we refer to it, then that is an exponential leap beyond homogenization at an academic level, which can't pass on experience. You can't do it through a model like that. And this shows in the state of a lot of therapists who are out there at the moment. They've just been homogenized and politically indoctrinated. So to be prepared to be a psychopomp, prepared by experience and training, some kind of mentorship is the right kind of role. That's our view. And the people who've mentored us in the past, whatever the limitations of their focus personally, each of them gave something that we cannot let go of because it is so valuable. It's been pressure tested, but it is so valuable. And without the relationship personally and the guidance that we had, we couldn't have done what we've done. And in our turn, that's the truth very often for other people who are coming through. You can offer it, but it has to be received. And if it's not received, then there is an issue of character and calling, because what is offered is always not to do with the character of the person who is offering the mentorship, not personally. Something is transmitted. This is understood in the East very, very well. Not so much in the West, where everything is about some kind of gain or exploitation on either side of things. But we very much believe in a mentorship model for therapists. That's how we work.
As well, if I might add something, that relationship, if done successfully, then it really blunts a lot of the risks of being, I suppose, paced and led by the state or by the larger cultural, political, manipulating or influencing force.
Yeah.
Where whatever force of confirmation that is missing there then gets displaced into the authority of a state or of a political person or of a pseudo guru, for example.
Yeah.
So it might, if that done properly, then we can see a lot of the current issues of attachment to such individuals then is reduced, but it seems that there isn't any cultural containment for that relationship in any clear manner anyways in the West, which allows for such risks and issues to continue really occurring.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And I would say the best mentors are more psychopomps than shamans, because they guide and then they leave, they depart. They don't have top-down influence and control. It's more by example and guidance, but it honors the character and calling of the individual, provided it's there. If it's not there, that's a different matter. If it is there, then it should nurture from within that person, because opportunities are given for that person to develop and grow. It's tough. It's a hard thing to undertake if you're actually mentoring someone. We know this because we've been through that process ourselves with many people as diverse as John Kane, Anthony Stevens, and Peter Nixon as 3 examples of very different people. But each of those people offered something that we would not ever do without, and even the confirmation from Franz Jung as well. That experience was something which is a deep understanding of an honor-bound duty towards completion, and I regard that as a job well done by him. As with all of them, then we have to prove it, and this young man has to prove it. Once he gets his insight and understanding, when the shaman removes the shame, he then has to do something, which is the next step. And rather than borrow, say, Joseph Campbell's rather elaborate sort of understanding of the hero cycle, which, can become formulaic, his individual task is all about him, and it's not collective. Like we say, for example, a personal myth is not a collective myth. It has to be lived. We have to go through it. This young man is going to go through something, without which he can't complete that cycle. The mentorship offered by the shaman would have failed at that point, because this young man would not be able to deliver into the world. That's the challenge, and we don't need the elaboration of someone like Joseph Campbell, nice guy, and all the rest of it, but it's too elaborate and it's too abstract. Every individual we meet goes through this in a different way, but there are deep structures, what Jung would call archetypes, but we would look at the context. The context is bigger than the individual representation. So this shaman is not the self-archetype. If this is the self-archetype, then the shaman's a part of it, but it's not all of it. The image, the representation here, has got so much in it which extends beyond the immediate moment. That shows us how big meta-instincts are, because those meta-instincts anticipate others, and they have received others that has brought them online, which is a massively extended field. And I know Jung's self-archetype is supposed to be the totality of psychology. That's not enough, because what about biology and its extent? And what about the physical laws? What about the platonic? All of that has to be superpositioned with any immediate experience we're going through in representation. So a psychologized model, say, of Jung's self-archetype, which at minimum is a projection of the genome into the psychological imagistic representation of itself, has to go beyond only that. It has to be more than that. It has to become the lived scenario. That is the transformative process. Whereas if we were to turn that shaman into the Jung self-archetype, we would be internally hypnotized by what would in effect be a deep structure complex. We've internalized the idea of Jung's self-archetype, and there he is. And we sit there staring at it and not doing anything. Whereas a scenario says, this is a representation of where you are now, but there was a lot going on before, there's more coming on after. You live with the narrative as it unfolds, because this moment has been anticipated and prepared for, and the next one is a continuation of it that you must live. And that living is the outside and the inside superpositioned as an extended field. So we move on. Redemption by trial. We've got a cave bear here, and in the real Paleolithic world, he would be in deep trouble. So this is not literal. This is a symbolic representation of any kind of trial of adaptation. It may be that he only has to stand there and stare the bear down without running. Running would be a bad move, of course. That would encourage the attack. But the fact that he has the courage to do that, to stand on his own against something which is threatening and will be understood by the collective of his tribe and by the ancestors, would be sufficient. On the wall, we've got the illumination by the fire, and there are people there, there are handprints there made by past generations, and there are also animals. It's a representation of his world and of the boundaries and limitations of it. Something that satisfies that would be enough for him, and something which satisfies adaptation to the external world will be enough to remove shame, even if it was legitimate. In fact, particularly if it were so. Because at that point then, society, a healthy society, a healthy peer group within a society will bring a person back into relationship to it. It is as if the ancestors are satisfied, and there's an understanding that we feel psychologically, emotionally, representationally about that, which emerges, it's released directly from the genome, and then it's shared collectively. So some kind of redemption or action in the world will be necessary. This then will lead to the restoration of his status of acceptance within the group. He made a mistake. He's done what was necessary. He's now back, and it's forgotten, literally forgotten in that sense, other than the fact that it will be remembered that he went through something that was the making of him. He now can guide somebody else who makes a mistake and can help him go through that process. The judgment by his peers, his ancestors, the accessing of the spiritual transpersonal world, then the action in the external world, and then the confirmation of that restoration. That is an individuated Paleolithic or Mesolithic human being according to natural instinct. But what about the contemporary period? Well, it's a bit different, isn't it? However nice it may appear to be, it's an unnatural from a Paleolithic, Mesolithic context situation to be in. What kind of challenges do we have? Well, guilt complexes often form around the family constellation. Adler was aware of this. Freud was aware of it. Jung was too, but he tended to leave this period of adaptation to Freud and Adler, and then, if you like, pick up the pieces later. But being scapegoated within a family, that often happens. One person carries the blame, one person carries the guilt for everybody else. This allows a redistribution of responsibility between other members, and it's based very much on the stability of the family unit. In this representation, then, it's the young man, as if this is the reincarnation of the Mesolithic, Paleolithic young man from before, is now in a context where he's been scapegoated by the family enough to have developed a guilt complex, so he responds even when it's not his fault. This is illegitimate guilt in a contemporary context. The family. The judging father who is checking down his mother. The sister who is concerned about the same old habitual pattern which is coming into expression again, but at least it's not her, because her brother will take on the blame. He is the scapegoat. Because he's slightly older, his experience of the relationship of the parents within a contemporary culture was such that the foundation was laid in him to respond that way with illegitimate guilt and carry that to maintain the stability of the family, which is actually an unstable system. But this is very often what happens in our world at the moment. Where's the redemption for this young man? It's not there, because this is, I mentioned repetition. This is the field of repetition compulsion within the family context, the family constellation, as Jung described it. He would have said, that if, and he did do this with families, that if he applied the Jung Ritalin word association test and psychophysiological stress test into that family, they would all produce exactly pretty much the same, with very little variation results, because they are all synchronous with one another, with that one exception that the family scapegoat will respond more powerfully to that which is regulating the rest of the family. This can be the template that is laid down for the rest of life if it's not dealt with. It starts with the family, or at least it can do. And that can lead to this in a school environment. There's a predominance of females there, and that is because, unfortunately, I don't know how you feel on this, but that a lot of the shaming is coming towards young men from young women. There's a group effect, even though the teacher is male. If he's woken his orientation, even if he isn't, he'll be pulled into the necessity to adapt to the culture within which he's operating. And the back wall there, respect, integrity, and effort be the change. There is no change in the system that will not change, and that will treat aberrants in this social exclusion way. So there's a lot of symbolism in there. There's this young man, he should be forming relationships, he should be looking forward to, the rest of his life and adapting in that way. The other young men are isolated, they're at the back. The focus of power is coming from the women, and he's responding in the same way that he did to the family constellation. The teacher is his father by transference. The young women are his sisters, but worse, because they are now a collective and have no sympathy for him because of the effect of the culture. And the young men who should be his peers and friends are completely isolated and can't help him. So the social exclusion can continue on from the family constellation, and the guilt complex then can just seek out shaming situations and even bring them about to confirm it. It's like, I'm so used to feeling shame because I am guilty of whatever, I will have to engineer that in order to keep the complex happy, because I'll feel so stressed because it's the complex that's feeling stressed. If I don't find that confirmation, so I bring it about. There's the social exclusion. I adopt the shameful posture, the feeling of guilt, and then the complex subsides a little bit, and then the feeling that I feel is mine. But it's not. It's still the feeling of the complex, because it delivers its reward negatively in this way, and basically says, if you don't do this, you're going to feel even worse because I will turn on you so badly. You have to seek confirmation for how I, the complex, feel, and you must identify with it. So it's carried over in this way. And of course, all that's happening is he's reinforcing the beliefs that those young women have about young men collectively. So the preparation has been laid for the next stage of his life. This can come about by emotional manipulation by young women who have been conditioned to get their own way and to manipulate men. I'm not having a downer on women at all, not. This is a cultural phenomenon that is present, and we all know that this is the case. They will often do that to force him to adopt a subdominant, emotionally manipulated state, and he's been so entrained by his life he will do it. Then the secondary gain for the young woman's tears and emotional expression is that she gets what she wants from him. She controls him. She works out on him, keeps him subdominant. There isn't an equal relationship going on here. His guilt complex will have actively sought out a partner who will do that to him, and then his sense of shame will persist to the point where it occupies his mind, it occupies everything that he interacts with internally as ideas and associations, except for the fantasy of escape. How do I get out of this? He'll probably refer to the culture and what happens there. Collective guilt and identity shaming, which is a gross amplification of what we saw with social exclusion and what was going on in his relationship, all of which also feeds back into the family constellation. And it's like, what can I do? What can I do? How can I relate? My instincts tell me to relate to women, but they're just adding to this sense of shame. Further and further, he will be pushed away into social exclusion and fantasy, whilst the guilt complex pressures him to go and find confirmation, Go find women who will do this to you, because that's the only truth you know. And he goes out into the culture, the cumulative cultural influences, representations on the right of Friedrich Nietzsche, on the left of Carl Jung. We've even got Epstein and co there, even Joe Rogan, and then a couple of popular internet gurus. They will all contribute to things he cannot aspire to. He doesn't apparently have the character, the strength of character, the ego strength to be able to achieve anything that these people did, but at the same time, he's vulnerable to the impressions that are thrown at him. So even his fantasies can't help, because these are his fantasies. I mean, Nietzsche was a total failure at relating. He was also insane. Least said about the guy in the middle, the better. And the fellow over on the left, his actual lived life was opposite to how he's believed in through the culture at the moment. And it's important to know about the backdrop to him as a human being, so we don't turn him into a reified fantasy object, which can then be internalized and either use us to separate off from adaptation to the world, or fail to see how even he said, "Don't copy me." So this very often is what you find in the unconscious of these young men. The way out's going to be inner work, some kind of approach which does not rely on internet gurus. And in there, you'll find the representation of the ancestral shaman. You'll have the transformative ritualized processes, the peer group that accepts, but you also get the psychopomp in the form of the trickster, as this appears in culture at the moment. Without that inner work, he cannot access things that contradict the external cultural influences and the configuration this has taken within him as they got identified with complex. And you have to use altered states of consciousness to do this, because if you cannot separate off from the conditioning and the identification with the ego identified with complex, all you will do is find confirmation for it everywhere in the form of inflated fantasies, internet gurus, shaming collective representations, all of these things. That's all you're going to find. You have to separate from that. You have to access that ancestral psyche and meet the psychopomp, usually these days in the form of what we could understand as being the trickster. The trickster has to play tricks, has to shock the ego and say there is another way. You have to do that, but to access the trickster as a collaborative function, the ego has to dial down its complexes. It has to go through those separation stages that you guys are familiar with, the proper way to use altered states of consciousness. Then he will meet the psychopomp and get his inner healing. At this point, there is no necessity for external help. The trickster then is amusing and amused and also offering failure as well as success. This is the inner challenge. This is the inner trial that we have these days. But he can approach the state where he can shift his consciousness, symbolized by the metronome and the pocket watch, his Chevreau's pendulum. And then once he's dissociated off from that complex, then he can begin the process of being free and reconfiguring himself. But there is an understanding that will emerge out from this that's delivered by the psychopomp. And that understanding is this: from psychopomp to shaman. In the outside world, he needs to be able to see the presence of the ancestral psyche without leaving his contemporary world. Both are represented here. It's as if he can sit with the ancestral wisdom from the past, but still sit in this world where he belongs. And the past, the positive aspects of the past are superpositioned into the present, but transformed. He now knows the way to access the ancestral psyche is through altered states of consciousness and the trickster as psychopomp, not as a compensating factor that will lead him into more and more trouble, which will happen if he's misdirected by false prophets and internet gurus. So once he's got that position sorted, that he's now sitting on the cusp of an outer adaptation and an inner understanding, he's then ready for integration and acceptance back into his peer group. All of this will come about because he will change in how he refers to others. And that biopsychosocial symbols on his sweatshirt, symbolic of the fact that in his heart he's understood the field nature of relationships and also of the relativity of time when it comes to the psyche. The ancestral psyche is still with us. The ancestral psyche is still useful. It still projects into our future. And the integration between those three, the bio, the psycho, and the social, is what he can bring about as a field interaction and relationship that will cause changes in other people. And at that point, essentially, the job of adaptation is done, and he has dealt with his illegitimate guilt. Then we get this: inner work, outer life, integrated, whole, and ready. The journey within creates the life without. He's understood the configuration on the inside, and he's transposed that from his heart into the reality of external relationships. Guilt, then, the illegitimate guilt that he suffered from his whole life up to this point, is seen for what it is, an illusion, and that he can separate from identification from that and adapt. And then this question comes: guilty or not? Well, there's the judge, and at this point, now the answer unequivocally is not guilty. So that, if you like, is a representation of the process. And because it's put in imagistic form, it takes on a narrative form as well that accompanies it. And insofar as that mirrors natural processes, it is affected. If it were to be overly elaborated, it can be appropriated to fantasy, which leads to inertia and stasis and the maintenance of the complex. But if it's done properly, then the final judgment is not guilty, illegitimate, case dismissed, back out into the world and live your life. So that's the process as we work that with people. Over to you guys. Would you find him guilty or not guilty once you've gone through that?
Hopefully and predictably should.
I'm gonna get my friend to probably come online. Yeah, got you.
Yeah. I said that preferably and predictably should be not guilty at this moment after after undergoing this process, and it'll probably be a very clear felt sense of being integrated and well placed within their context, and the distribution of the resolution of the guilt complex will find its representation really in across the biopsychosocial levels. So and hopefully that becomes in itself, or the person, their own field becomes a type of germ for other people to be influenced in a positive sense, their own field to be redistributed in a positive sense, where that specific complex finds resolution in his own process and his own field.
Yeah, thank you, Omar. Cool.
Oh yes, I mean he's gone from being the family scapegoat, the scapegoat amongst his peers, to being, and I can hear Caesar Milan saying this, to being pack leader.
Yeah.
Amongst his own peers. So he's now in a position, and he's transcended the guilty, not guilty polarity, to become himself, to become integrated. And he is now in a position to influence his peers positively, which of course is the best way to do it, really. If it's a case of kicking back against a culture which is toxic, then the way to do it is within a peer group, and by taking the lead within that group, and being influential in a positive way that means that whatever is happening beyond that group actually doesn't matter that much. So it's a very uplifting ending, really, isn't it? And but an absolutely achievable ending as well. Again, it's such a positive and simple idea, that of becoming the pack leader. In terms of the energy of your individual field and your capacity to influence others. That's it's such a simple idea, but such an effective one. We all know this, don't we?
We do.
We all know that we respond differently to people who are like that energetically than we do to people who appear to be wounded, who appear to be withdrawn from society because of that wound, and are acting defensively as a result of that. But somebody who steps up, and again, I can imagine Caesar encouraging that young man to do that, to stand proud, and to bring that positive, assertive energy out, and to transform the group within which he exists. Then
And just to add to that, I love this much distinction, because Peterson used to say things similar to that, but the delivery from Peterson contrasted with Caesar Milan is worlds apart.
Oh yes.
Because Caesar's all about energy, not about words, and not about aggressive posturing, but calm, assertive, as he calls it, with dogs, leadership, rather than the aggressive posturing that you get that's pushed by the likes of Peterson and a few other top rank, we can call them, I guess, podcast gurus, who really put people into a position where they're going to fail, where they become the nail that needs to be knocked down, where they trigger other people. And Caesar's approach is not like that.
No.
And he works with humans in relationship to dogs. And that's so nuanced an understanding of instinct. I don't think there's probably many people, many psychotherapists, who are anywhere near understanding what Caesar Milan understands. Because he, as he says, he rehabilitates dogs, but he trains people. So he has to retrain the human in order for the human to fit in with the natural world.
Yeah.
Um,
And then the human finds the proper place in the pack,
Yeah.
which is as it should be, as pack leader.
yeah.
Because most of the time they're not, are they? They've assumed some kind of subdominant position within the pack, and that's the problem, because the dog has control
Yeah.
of the context when that happens.
Yeah.
I think the other thing, which I think is very valuable from him as well, Steve, is that even with dogs who have been severely abused, and for him, of course, because it is an instinctive model, the idea that the dog is a dog before it is a breed and before it has a name which is given to it by the humans in the pack is really important. And even with severely abused dogs, he doesn't feel sorry for them. And then this made me think too about what you were saying earlier about the orthopedic surgeon with the wooden leg, in the sense that he doesn't project sympathy, if you like, for the wound. He doesn't feel sorry for the animal. He finds a way of connecting with it, connecting with instinct, in the sense that the dog is rehabilitated in the present and therefore for the future, but he doesn't confirm the wounds of the past. And yet a lot of dog owners do that. He goes into a situation where the dog owners have felt sorry for the animal, and that's made them weak, and it's made the dog dominant. So he never does that. He never confirms a wound.
No.
And I think that's really important, because sometimes, I think particularly with things like illegitimate guilt, when people really get into it, they get into that victimhood mentality, which of course, again, the culture would want. The culture likes, as it is at the moment, likes to produce victims. At the moment, it tends to be young men of a specific background, which I won't get into, but I'm sure everybody knows what I mean. And they're then made to feel bad and carry the shame for any other young man who fits that particular description. So the idea of getting away from victimhood, I think, is really important. And the same for women too,
Yeah.
because women have been brainwashed into believing that they are victims and that somehow that justifies them working out on men when it clearly doesn't. So these are just very simple ways of moving beyond those very powerful influences, really, which come at us from the culture. So no victimhood, no confirmation of wounds, building resilience, building belief, self-confirmation, which of course then means that people then project the right kinds of energy, and then they then in turn influence other people with that good energy. And we can all do this. It's not difficult.
No, when it happens, it's easy, isn't it? It's always complexes because they misdirect or calf instincts. They turn the libido of life, the life force, into something that fuels them.
Yes.
The parasitical, even if they started off as protective, once as Janet observed they achieve autonomy, that's it. They then superposition, as we were saying about Omar earlier, into any state that they can.
Yeah.
So it appears we can't lose them. That's the best way to be confirmed, is to appear everywhere. So when the ego checks itself, the identification is confirmed every single
With
time.
every angle. Yes.
Yeah, and cognition alone is not enough.
No.
Because it tends to abstract itself. So you can think all you like, but your feelings you've got a completely different opinion.
Yes.
And affect or emotion, the carrier wave of instinct, the emissary of its master, the genome, you have to go through those stages and get into the representations of the ancestral psyche. Then things change. You are then different. You change because you are your inheritance.
Yes.
So you make it conscious. You identify with that and not with the complex. The difference is I can't even find the right.
Yes. Yeah. It's even more than night and day, isn't it? It's so transformed.
Beyond that.
It is. Yeah.
It's way beyond. And then you change others because you're different.
Yeah.
Not because you think you are, or that you use strategies to manipulate other people. That goes back to the Caesar thing that you're saying.
It does, yes.
That what he calls energy. He says, for example, dogs read energy. They don't think in verbal terms. They understand words, but it's all about energy.
Yeah.
And if your energy is good, they bond with you, and if it's not, they won't. It's like that with people. If you've got good energy, you will draw people to you. You become attractive.
Yeah.
In that general sense. If not, then what you do attract, if anything at all, is derision and exclusion, victimization. Because Darwin will say that person is non-optimal, will drag the group's resources down, will soak up too much attention. And that kind of speak is what you hear at a cultural collective level when they decide to outgroup someone or a bandwidth people who can be categorized in that way. And they can be excluded or justified for elimination from the gene pool. So Darwin never goes away. We've got to reckon with Darwin. And the best way to do that is to access the collective psyche, because the ancestral psyche, knows how to deal with Darwin. It's got all of the experience about how to deal with this in it. That's why it's ancestral. It's survived. So we go to that, and then we adapt immediately in the moment. And then the future reconfigures to receive us. If it had anticipated us differently, then we move towards that anticipation. Intuition will take us into a trap. I mean, subjective intuition here, not transpersonal meta intuition. But if you reconfigure in the moment, the future changes too. That's the way to do it.
Yeah. Rewrite your narrative. If it's going in a particular direction, you can rewrite it. Yeah.
Just like in a novel.
Yes.
Novels should be predictable at an instinctive level, but the prediction should be change, not stasis. For the individual, as figure to ground of the ancestral psyche, where all of these solutions are available for us. So it's not cognitive, that's a mistake. And it's not fantasy, that's a mistake too.
It's a mistake to think too that humans can't read because again, Caesar talks about the fact that we are emotion, affect, to our dogs. And we are to people as well. And as cognitive as we might try and be at times, people will still read our energy, and it'll be at that level that we're manipulated sometimes into doing things that we may or may not want to do. So it pays, doesn't it, to not attach too heavily to cognition, and to believe that somehow it is the solution to all our ills, and to protecting ourselves from social engagements and so on, because it simply isn't.
No.
And some people will be very, very good at reading our energy intuitively. They just, we all know people who are like that,
Dog
who
flag
just,
types do.
oh yes, they'll
Yeah.
literally spell you coming. Unfortunately, like a dog would pick up your scent. They will absolutely know.
They are like they are like complexes in that both are parasitical.
Yeah.
And so avoid them if it's all possible.
Mm. Mm. Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. So this works, and the ancestral psyche, that's the resource you need to go to, and you will find a way then to safely identified with complexes, and the mechanism is controlled dissociation through building up ego strength, because homeostasis will receive you down on the inside, otherwise it won't, because if you take the perspective of the non-ego psyche, which obviously is also your biology, the last thing you want is a disordered conscious personality bludgeoning in like a bull in a china shop and wrecking everything on the inside, including your metabolism and gene expression. So we are kept out when we're not ready. And the complexes will parasitize even that. So they will even utilize homeostasis against us by dividing us off from it. But once you do it, you bypass the complexes. And that is their biggest fear.
Yeah. I mean, the more you can do this for yourself, the better.
Absolutely.
I mean, we're just building the caveat that because we're dealing with things that very often, if we're talking about guilt, that exist in the dark, that they're often shrouded in secrecy, that it's really important, if you go the therapy route, who you choose, because there are a lot of political therapists out there.
Yeah.
And my view, I'm sure yours is the same, Steve. I personally think that's a disgusting thing.
Yeah, I do.
So if you go for therapy, do your best to be selective, in a good way about who you choose. Do your homework. Find out what models of psychotherapy exist out there, and how that's likely to play out for you in your current situation. Because the last thing that you would want to go is to go and see someone, share something which is incredibly intimate to you, and have the culture view you by proxy through that individual therapist and make an assessment on you based on the culture.
Yeah.
That's the last thing that you want to happen. So I'm not suggesting everyone out there is like that, or all therapists practice in that way, because they don't. But there is a preponderance of them right now, and you need to be careful how you navigate that. So if you go the therapy route, make sure that you get somebody who has not been polluted in that way, if you possibly can, or better still, do it for yourself, because you can do that as well. It is possible.
100%. Thanks, Paul. Steve.
That's a brilliant point, Pauline, just that you've made there, just to take the field perspective as a therapist as well, and the ancestral psyche in the equation. Throughout this whole process of looking at the cards and that, what kept coming up is like, well, firstly, I mean, illegitimate guilt never even crossed my radar all my life. Until you gave that piece, it was like a Rubik's Cube. It fitted in that it like I had so much more libido to kind of process self-development through a different lens. It was like really the key to unlock so much that it held me back on an instinctual and developmental right going forward to reach potential. So I thought that was a very poignant thing through the course. And then through going through, like, even having guilt, because we all are human and at times be guilty of certain thing, you go through it, and there's self-acceptance through that. Not confidence, you develop confidence from self-acceptance. So it's a process that you can go through and come out the other side.
Mhm. Oh, absolutely, Niamh. And to hear you speak in that way will be very reassuring for a lot of people. And as you rightly say too, that nuanced distinction between legitimate and illegitimate guilt, it is such an important separation, isn't it? And it's I would say, on balance, I don't know what you think, Steve, that probably most of the people we see are suffering from illegitimate guilt.
Definitely. Yeah. There's always a way out of the other one.
Yes.
Illegitimate guilt can even lead to suicide.
Yes. Mm.
It can be that dangerous.
Yeah, it can.
And people hang on to the notion of being guilty when they're not. They never were. They
Yeah.
were put in that state of division and then belief about themselves because the gap was filled with a complex. And that's the thing you're up against. That it's a monster.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. And that comes back to what we were saying earlier about you become the tragic hero rather than the hero who actually fights back and wins.
Yeah.
And we need to avoid that at all costs, don't we? We need to avoid people going down that path of believing the only solution is to remove themselves from the equation.
Your life becomes a film noir.
Yeah, that's it does. Yes, it does.
And you needn't be in that movie,
No. Write the sequel, positive sequel to it or something like that, but certainly rewrite the narrative.
So it was.
Yes.
Like in a dream and suddenly in a different place.
Yeah.
Follow your instincts.
Yes.